The wind carried a low whistle as it swept across the plains, stirring dust and rattling the dry grass around Jacob Turner's ranch. He sat on the front porch, hat tipped low, boots planted firmly on the boards worn smooth from years of pacing. The day was ending the same way all others seemed to end, quiet, lonesome, and heavy with the sound of nothing but his own thoughts. At 35, Jacob had lived more years alone than he cared to admit. His ranch stretched wide hundreds of acres of land dotted with cattle, a handful of horses, and the broken remnants of what once had been his father's dream. Jacob had worked it tirelessly, rising before dawn, laboring until the sun slipped beyond the horizon, and returning home to a house that was always too empty. The neighbors, scarce though they were, had begun to notice. They'd make comments when they passed him in town. "Fine ranch you've got there, Jacob. Just needs a woman's touch," old Mrs. Avery had said once, with a knowing smile. Others teased him gently about being the last unmarried man his age in the county. He laughed it off, but inside, the truth gnawed at him. He longed for someone waiting at the end of his days, someone to share more than just silence and chores. But the frontier was not kind to a man looking for companionship. The nearest town was small, and most of the young women had long since married or moved east in search of more promising lives. Those who remained weren't eager to tie themselves to the life of hard labor on an isolated ranch. Jacob wasn't one to charm or sweet-talk either. He was steady, reliable, and quiet, traits good for keeping cattle alive through storms, but not enough to win a woman's heart with ease. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Jacob's eyes fell on a crumpled newspaper tucked between old ledgers on the table inside. He unfolded it, smoothing the page where an advertisement caught his attention once more. Mail-order brides available. Respectable women seeking marriage and new life on the frontier. Write for details. He'd seen it before, dismissed it as foolish or desperate, but tonight, with the sound of his own boots echoing in a house too big for one man, it didn't seem foolish. It seemed possible. Jacob stared at the ad, weighing the idea. He could write a letter, explain who he was, describe the ranch, offer stability. Maybe some woman, somewhere, wanted what he had to give. He didn't want a stranger for a wife, not truly, but perhaps this was the only way. Still, doubts gnawed at him. What if she didn't suit him? What if she hated the ranch, or the endless toil, or him? What if she came expecting comfort and luxury and found only dirt floors and worn-out furniture? But another thought pushed its way forward. What if she was kind? What if she wanted the same simple things he did? A family, a partner, a home built on work and trust. Jacob pulled out a scrap of paper, his large hand gripping the pencil with surprising gentleness. He didn't know what to write. Not really, but the words began to spill, slowly. He told the truth. He was a rancher, alone, with land that needed tending and a heart that wanted company. He promised honesty, hard work, and loyalty. He did not ask for beauty, nor wealth. Just someone who would not mind the quiet life. When he reached the part of the form that asked if he required a photograph, Jacob hesitated. He thought of the men in town who spoke about women like they were horses, judging by shape, color, and size. He thought of how many times appearance had been weighed more heavily than character. And then he made his choice. "No," he muttered, writing the word firmly. He didn't need a picture. If this was to work, it would not be about what the eye saw, but what the heart could carry. Jacob sealed the letter, his pulse thrumming with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. For the first time in a long while, he imagined a different tomorrow, one where he wasn't the only voice echoing through the halls, one where laughter might spill out into the night air. As he set the envelope aside to be taken into town with the morning's chores, Jacob leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars gathering overhead. He knew the risks. He knew he might be making a mistake, but as the night settled over the ranch, he whispered a quiet truth to himself. "I'm tired of being alone." And with that, his life began to change, though not in any way he could have ever predicted. Clara Whitfield sat at the edge of her narrow bed in the upstairs room of the boarding house, staring at the letter crumpled in her hands. She had read it so many times the paper had softened at the folds. The ink smudged slightly where her thumb had rested. The words were simple, plain, but honest. A rancher, seeking a wife. He promised nothing beyond steady work, loyalty, and a home on the frontier. He had written with a careful hand, as though each word mattered. Clara had answered many ads over the past year, hoping for an escape from the life that bound her. But none had stirred her heart as this one did. Yet fear clung to her like a shadow. Clara was not the kind of woman men sought in advertisements. She was tall, nearly as tall as most men she met, and her frame was broad and strong. Years of hauling laundry, scrubbing floors, and carrying heavy buckets had built a body more used to labor than finery. Where other women had delicate figures and dainty steps, Clara's hands were roughened, her arms firm with muscle. Dresses rarely fit properly. They were too tight across the shoulders or too short at the hem. She had overheard whispers all her life. Too big, not ladylike. No man will want a wife like that. Each phrase had carved into her heart until she began to believe it herself. That was why she had never dared send her likeness with her letters. Men who saw her turned away quickly enough. She had learned to let her words speak for her instead. And yet, Jacob Turner, the rancher from the plains, had written back, not once, but several times. His letters were thoughtful, steady, the kind of letters that spoke of a man who worked hard and wasted little time on frills. He never asked her for a photograph, and she did not offer one. He wrote of the land, of cattle, of the endless work of the ranch. But in between those lines she glimpsed something else, loneliness, and a yearning that echoed her own. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it on the small trunk at the foot of her bed. She stood and moved toward the cracked mirror hanging above the washstand. The reflection staring back at her was one she knew too well. Dark hair pinned hastily, shoulders squared too wide for her thin cotton dress, blue eyes that held both determination and doubt. Would he turn away if he saw me now? She whispered. To the glass, the thought twisted inside her, but then another rose, quiet and stubborn. She had spent too many years shrinking into herself, apologizing for the body God had given her. Perhaps this was her chance to step into a life where strength was not a curse, but a gift. A ranch needed sturdy hands, steady arms, and a back that could bear weight. She had all those, and more. Besides, hadn't Jacob written that he wanted honesty, not beauty? That he desired a partner, not a picture-perfect wife? Clara clung to those words like a lifeline. Downstairs, the sounds of the boarding house stirred, the creak of floorboards, the chatter of women preparing for the evening meal, the scrape of a chair against the wood floor. Life here was crowded, noisy, and unkind to dreamers. Clara knew her days would only continue in drudgery if she stayed. Laundry, scrubbing, endless toil, until her youth slipped into old age with nothing to show for it but calloused hands. Her decision was already made, though her heart raced at the thought she would go. That night, Clara sat by the lamplight and wrote her acceptance. Her handwriting was careful, though her hand trembled as she formed each word. She told him she was willing to come, that she wanted the life he offered, and that she longed for a place to belong. She did not describe her appearance, not once. If he was to reject her, let it be after he had looked into her eyes, not after glancing at a photograph. When the letter was sealed, Clara held it against her chest for a long moment, whispering, a silent prayer. Lord, let this be the path you've set before me. Give me courage to walk it. The next morning, she handed the envelope to the postmaster with a shaky smile. As the train whistle blew in the distance, she imagined herself upon it, leaving behind the whispers, the shame, and the small life she had known. Ahead waited a man she had never seen, a ranch she had never set foot on, and a future filled with uncertainty. But in that moment, Clara felt something she hadn't in years: hope. And hope, she decided, was worth every risk. The first letter from Clara reached Jacob on a chilly morning in late autumn. He found it waiting for him at the post office when he rode into town for supplies. The envelope was small, neatly sealed, with a careful hand that suggested someone who had thought long before putting pen to paper. Jacob sat on the bench outside the general store, tearing the flap open with a thumb roughened from years of rope burns and calluses. His eyes scanned the words once, then twice, and before he realized it, he was smiling. Her name was Clara. She wrote with a plain-spoken honesty that mirrored his own. No flowery declarations, no lofty dreams of riches. She spoke of hard work, of resilience, of knowing how to stretch little into much. She did not pretend life was easy where she was. She told him she had endured hardships and loss, but threaded between the lines was a quiet strength that struck him like sunlight, breaking through a cloud. Jacob tucked the letter carefully into his vest pocket and carried it home, as though it were made of gold. Weeks passed, and their letters became a rhythm. The mail came slowly, sometimes 2 weeks apart. But each envelope was like a gift, waiting to be unwrapped. In her second letter, Clara told him about her work at the boarding house, how her hands were always raw from scrubbing, how she sometimes sang to herself while hanging linens just to hear a voice besides her own. She confessed she dreamed of land, of wide spaces where she could breathe without walls pressing in on her. Jacob read that one 3 times before bed, then again by lantern light in the morning. He sat at the table, pencil in hand, writing back, "You'd find plenty of space here, Clara. Sometimes I think there's more sky than earth. A person could walk a mile and never hear another voice but the wind." His words were few, but he meant every one. By her third letter, Clara began to let her guard down. She told him how she had always felt out of place among women who were dainty and delicate, how she feared people judged her too quickly. She didn't speak of her size outright, but Jacob sensed a hesitation in her tone, as though she were holding something back. Still, he never asked. He didn't need to know the exact shape of her face or frame. What mattered was how her words made him feel less alone. He told her about his mother's quilt, the one folded at the end of his bed, about his favorite horse, Dusty, who always nudged his shoulder for oats. He told her of the winter storms that swept in without warning, and how sometimes the stars on a clear night stretched so far across the sky it made a man's chest ache just to look at them. And in return, Clara began writing longer letters. She told him about books she had read by candlelight, about the hymns she hummed while she worked, about how she once dreamed of teaching children to read. Her words painted her not as a stranger, but as someone Jacob already knew, someone who belonged in the spaces of his life. As winter deepened, the letters grew more personal. Clara asked if he ever felt lonely. Jacob answered plainly, "Every day, but less." "Since you've been writing," she asked if he was a patient man. He admitted he wasn't always, but he tried. She asked what he wanted most in life, and he told her not to live and die with no one knowing my story. Her reply nearly undid him. "If I come, Jacob, I will know your story, and you will know mine." Sometimes, when the ranch was quiet and the only sound was the fire snapping in the hearth, Jacob found himself reading her letters aloud. Hearing her voice in his mind was a comfort he hadn't expected. He tucked the pages into a wooden box, locking them away like treasures. It surprised him how much he looked forward to them. He had thought a wife would mean help with chores, meals on the table, a companion by necessity. But Clara's letters stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Anticipation. By spring, the decision was made. She would come. Her final letter told him she had purchased a train ticket, and she would arrive within the month. Jacob read that letter 3 times under the fading light of dusk, his pulse quickening. The woman whose words had filled the emptiness of his days would soon be real, standing before him, but even then, he didn't wonder what she looked like. He didn't care. All he knew was this: he wanted her there. Beside him, what he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was how stunned he would be the moment she stepped off that train. The morning Clara's train was due to arrive. Jacob woke before the rooster crowed. Sleep had been near impossible the night before. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window seemed to remind him that today was the day everything changed. He dressed carefully, not in his work shirt and worn boots, but in his Sunday clothes, the dark trousers pressed as best as he could manage, a clean white shirt, and the vest his mother had sewn for him years ago. His hands, no matter how hard he scrubbed, still bore traces of ranch work, but he figured that couldn't be helped. Clara ought to know. He was no gentleman of leisure, but a working man. The ride into town felt longer than usual, though his horse, Dusty, trotted at a steady pace. Jacob's heart thudded in rhythm with the hooves striking the packed dirt road. In his saddlebag, he carried the letters. Clara had written him every one of them. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps he wanted to hold a piece of her in his hands when he finally met the woman behind the words. When the town came into view, Jacob saw the thin plume of smoke curling from the depot chimney. The platform was already busy, folks gathering to greet travelers or simply to witness the arrival of the westbound train. Trains were still a novelty here, a link to the wider world, and people treated them like events. Jacob tied Dusty outside the general store and walked to the depot, trying not to fidget under the watchful eyes of townsfolk. Some of them knew why he was there. Word had spread. Jacob Turner, the quiet rancher, had sent for a mail-order bride. He heard snippets of conversation as he passed. "Reckon she'd be pretty, or just desperate. A man's got to take what he can. Get out here." Jacob set his jaw. It wasn't about pretty. It was about a home, about not ending every day with nothing but silence for company. The whistle of the train cut through his thoughts, sharp and high, followed by the thunder of iron wheels grinding to a halt. Steam hissed, enveloping the platform in a white cloud, and voices rose as passengers began to disembark. Mothers clutching children, businessmen with satchels, farmers returning from supply. Tripsel stepped down onto the wooden boards. And then she appeared. Clara. Jacob's breath caught before he even realized it. She was taller than many of the men who had stepped off the train, her shoulders broad beneath a plain traveling dress, her figure solid, strong, unmistakably different from the dainty picture he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. For a fleeting second, shock rippled through him. This was not the woman the town, or perhaps even he, deep down, might have expected. Clara paused at the edge of the platform, her blue eyes scanning the crowd nervously. She clutched a small carpetbag to her chest as though it were a shield. Her gaze landed on Jacob, and in that moment, her fear was plain fear of rejection, of disappointment, of being sent back on the very train she had arrived on. The townsfolk noticed, too. A few whispers rose among them, not unkind, but curious, edged with the judgments small towns carried so easily. "She's a big one," someone murmured. "Didn't think Turner would pick a woman like that." Jacob's chest tightened. He saw the way Clara's chin lifted slightly, as if she braced herself against the sting of those words. Strength radiated from her, though he could sense the vulnerability beneath it. She had taken a risk, leaving everything behind to come here, and now she stood waiting for his reaction. For the space of a heartbeat, Jacob wavered. He hadn't prepared himself for the image before him, but then his eyes met hers, steady, searching, filled with equal parts fear and hope, and everything else fell away. This was Clara, the woman who had filled his empty nights with words of courage, kindness, and truth. The woman who had risked her pride, her safety, her very future to meet him here. Jacob stepped forward, pushing through the thinning steam until he stood before her. He removed his hat, his voice low but steady. "Clara," he said, "welcome." Her lips parted, as though she had been holding her breath. "Jacob," he nodded, offering his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing hers in his. Her grip strong, almost surprising. In that touch, Jacob felt the reality of the warmth, the firmness, the undeniable presence of a woman unlike any other he had ever known. The townsfolk still whispered behind them, but Jacob didn't care. He saw only Clara, and though the shock still lingered, a deeper certainty began to stir. She had come all this way to stand beside him. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As the train's whistle blew once more, signaling its departure, Jacob realized his life had just crossed into a new chapter. The woman beside him was not the one he had pictured in idle moments, but she was real. And in time, he would learn she was far more than he had ever dared to hope for. The church bells tolled softly in the distance, their sound carrying across the small town like a summons. Inside the little whitewashed chapel, Jacob Turner stood stiffly near the altar, hat in hand, heart pounding harder than it ever had during a cattle stampede. It had been only 2 days since Clara arrived, and though they had spoken awkwardly, politely, he still hadn't found his footing. He'd expected a stranger, yes, but not a woman who unsettled him so deeply. From the moment she'd stepped off the train, her presence had filled the air. She was taller than him by a hair, broader across the shoulders, her frame undeniably strong. When she walked beside him through town, he felt the curious eyes of neighbors burning holes in his back, whispering, "Turner's bride. Didn't see that coming." He had smiled at her, offered his hand, carried her bag, but inside, he had been reeling. Clara was nothing like he had pictured in the private corners of his mind. She was too much, perhaps, and yet, he found himself unable to look away from her, eyes blue and searching. Full of courage, though, he could sense the hurt she carried. Now, standing at the altar as the townsfolk filled the pews, Jacob swallowed hard. His palms were damp, his mouth dry. Was he ready for this? The doors creaked open, and every head turned. Clara stepped into the church. The light from the tall windows caught her figure as she moved down the aisle. She wore a simple cream dress, the kind a woman might sew herself, but on her it became something more. The fabric hugged her broad shoulders and strong frame, yet she carried herself with a quiet grace, her chin lifted, her eyes locked forward. Jacob's breath faltered. He had been bracing himself for shame, for regret, for the weight of townsfolk's laughter pressing down on him. But in that moment, as Clara walked toward him, he felt something shift. She was not a mistake, she was not a burden, she was a force, steady and unyielding, and she was coming to stand at his side. Still, the whispers buzzed through the pews. He caught a few words, sharp as thorns. "She's a big one. Looks like she could outwork him. Not what I'd have chosen." Clara heard them too. He saw the flicker of hurt cross her eyes before she masked it with resolve. Jacob's jaw tightened. Anger sparked in his chest, not at her, but at them for their judgment, for their smallness. When she reached the altar, Clara paused, her gaze lifting to his. Jacob stared back, caught in the depth of her expression. He saw fear there, yes, but also hope. Hope that he would not reject her, hope that he might see beyond the frame of her body to the woman she truly was. For a heartbeat, Jacob felt his world tilt. He had dreamed of a wife who would fit neatly at his side, someone delicate, someone who would make him look strong. Clara did not fit that picture. No, she shattered it. She stood before him unashamed of her size, unashamed of her strength, daring him with her very presence to see her for who she was, and Jacob realized he wanted to. The preacher cleared his throat, beginning the ceremony, but Jacob hardly heard the words. He could not stop looking at her, her hands folded neatly in front of her, the faint tremor in her lip as if she feared he might step back, the strength in her shoulders as though she carried more than anyone else in that room could know. When it came time to join hands, Jacob reached for hers. Her palm was warm, her grip steady. The moment their fingers laced, something inside him settled. Yes, she was taller. Yes, she was broader. Yes, the town whispered. But none of that mattered here. In the stillness of the chapel, with her eyes locked on his when the preacher asked if he would take this woman as his wife, Jacob's answer came clear, steady, without hesitation. "I will." Clara's eyes widened, slightly, as if she hadn't dared believe it until that moment. And when her turn came, her voice rang firm and strong. "I will." The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and as Jacob leaned closer, pressing a hesitant but sincere kiss to her lips, the whispers of the crowd seemed to fade away. For the first time since he had sent his letter months ago, Jacob wasn't just a lonely rancher. He was a husband, and though he was still stunned, still reeling from the reality of Clara, he felt deep in his chest that his life had just been altered forever. The day after the wedding, Clara stepped out onto the porch of Jacob's ranch house with a broom in hand. The air smelled of sage and dust, the horizon stretching in endless waves of golden grass. For the first time since her arrival, she wasn't surrounded by the clamor of townsfolk or the murmur of judgment. Out here, the land was vast, quiet, almost forgiving, but her peace was short-lived. When she and Jacob had returned to town the previous evening for supplies, the stares had been sharper than ever. Some eyes had softened with curiosity, but most carried thinly veiled surprise. A few women had whispered behind their gloved hands. She'd caught words like unusual and doesn't match him, and she had seen the way some men nudged one another, smirking, as though Jacob had been tricked. Now sweeping the dust from the porch, Clara couldn't stop the ache in her chest. She had known this would happen. She had known the risk of coming without a picture, of stepping into a marriage where appearance would be the first thing judged. But knowing didn't make the sting any less sharp. Inside, Jacob sat at the table, with his morning coffee, his brow furrowed as he read through a ranch ledger. He looked up when he heard the broom rasping against the boards. "You don't need to start working right away," he said, his voice even. "You're not here to wear yourself out." Clara gave him a faint smile. "I am not one for sitting idle. Work makes me feel at home." Jacob nodded, though she thought she caught a flicker of something in his eyes' relief. Perhaps that she was not a woman expecting finery or ease. But later, when Jacob hitched the wagon and they rode back into town to collect a few supplies, he'd forgotten. The whispers grew louder. Clara felt them prick at her like thorns. At the mercantile, Mrs. Avery, a widow known for her sharp tongue, approached Clara with a too sweet smile. "Well, my dear, you must be Jacob's bride. We didn't expect you." Clara stiffened, unsure if Mrs. Avery realized how cruel the words sounded. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly, forcing a polite smile. "I'm Clara." Mrs. Avery's eyes flicked over her figure, then back to Jacob. "You've certainly got yourself a strong one. She'll work hard, I'm sure." Jacob's jaw tightened, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something. But instead, he only tipped his hat and guided Clara toward the counter. The silence between them afterward felt heavy, filled with things unsaid. By the time they returned home, Clara's heart was weary. She had tried to stand tall, to ignore the judgment, but she couldn't help the voice whispering inside her. "They're right. You don't belong here. He deserves someone prettier, someone softer." That night, as Jacob sat by the fire mending tack, Clara folded laundry quietly nearby. The flames threw shadows across his face, making him look older, warier. Finally, she gathered her courage. "Jacob," she began, her voice trembling despite herself. "Do you regret it?" He looked up, frowning. "Regret what?" "Sending for me, choosing me, the town they don't understand. I see the way they look at us." Jacob was silent for a long moment, his gaze steady on her. Then he set the leather aside and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Clara," he said slowly, "I didn't send for a picture. I sent for a wife. The kind of woman who'd stand by me through storms and droughts and long winters. That's what I wanted. That's who you are." Her breath caught, but still doubt lingered in her eyes. He softened his tone. "Let him whisper. They don't live my life. They don't run this ranch. And they don't sit at this table every night. You do. You're here. That's what matters." Clara swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. For the first time since she'd arrived, she felt a flicker of safety not in the town, not in the whispers of others, but in the quiet certainty of the man she had married. She didn't know yet how to silence the judgment around her, but as she looked across the fire at Jacob, she thought, perhaps, just perhaps, she could learn to silence it within herself. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and still, as though the plains themselves were holding their breath. Jacob rose early, nerves prickling under his skin. He had faced stampedes, flash floods, and winters so cold the cattle froze where they stood, but nothing had ever set his heart pounding like this. Beside him, Clara prepared quietly. She had altered her traveling dress into something fit for the occasion. Cream-colored muslin, plain but clean, with lace stitched carefully at the collar. Her hair, dark and thick, was twisted into a bun at the nape of her neck. Jacob watched her from the corner of his eye as she pinned it into place, her large hands surprisingly delicate with the task. She caught his gaze in the mirror and gave a tentative smile. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose this is it." Jacob cleared his throat. "Reckon so." He wished he had better words, something more eloquent, but they didn't come. Instead, he offered her his arm when it was time to leave, and she took it with quiet dignity. The little white chapel was filled with townsfolk by the time they arrived. Curiosity had spread quickly. Few could resist seeing the marriage of the rancher who had ordered a bride sight unseen. Jacob felt their eyes on him as he stepped to the front. He could almost hear their thoughts. What kind of woman would travel so far to marry a man she'd never met? What kind of man would take her? When the doors creaked open, silence fell. Clara entered, her steps measured, her head held high despite the weight of every whisper and stare pressing down on her. The sunlight through the tall windows caught the sheen of her dark hair and the steady blue of her eyes. She was not fragile, not delicate, not what the town had expected, but there was a quiet grace in the way she carried herself. Shoulders squared, as though daring anyone to call her less. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Yes, she was taller than him. Yes, she was broader, her presence commanding in a way that unsettled the expectations of everyone in the room. But as she walked toward him, Jacob felt something shift in his chest. Strength radiated from her, but so did vulnerability. Kind it took to stand in front of strangers and bind her life to his dot when she reached him. Clara looked up into his eyes, searching. Jacob thought he saw the question written there. Do you regret this? Do you want me here? For a heartbeat, the noise of the room seemed to fade, leaving only her gaze holding him steady. And in that gaze, Jacob found his answer. The preacher's voice rose, steady and solemn, asking the ancient questions. Jacob barely heard the words. His heart thudded as he held Clara's hand, her palm warm and firm against his. Do you take this woman? Jacob's throat tightened, but his answer came clear. I do. Clara's lips trembled as the preacher turned to her. Do you take this man? Her voice rang out, strong and unwavering. I do. A murmur rippled through the pews, some surprised, some approving, some doubtful. But neither of them paid it any mind. When the preacher declared them man and wife, Jacob leaned forward. Their first kiss was brief, hesitant, yet filled with a sincerity that went deeper than passion. Clara's hand tightened in his, as though anchoring herself to him, and in that touch Jacob felt a vow far stronger than words. As they turned to face the congregation, Jacob caught the stares, the raised brows, the whispered comments, but he no longer cared. For the first time, he saw Clara not through the eyes of others, but through his own. She was not the woman he had pictured when he first rode away for a bride. She was something else entirely, and though the road ahead was uncertain, Jacob felt a strange certainty take root. He had chosen her, and standing here at the altar, he realized Clara had chosen him, too. Together, they stepped out of the chapel into the sunlight, husband and wife. The whispers followed, but Jacob squeezed her hand and whispered, low enough for her alone to hear, let em talk. They don't know you like I do. Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes glistening. For the first time since stepping off the train, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she belonged. The wedding day had passed, leaving behind echoes of whispers and the heavy eyes of the town. Now, Clara and Jacob returned to the ranchman and wife, bound by vows but still strangers beneath the surface. The ranch house was modest. Weathered wood, a slanted roof that creaked when the wind blew, and rooms that smelled faintly of hay and saddle leather. Clara stepped inside, setting down her small trunk. She looked around carefully, drinking in the sight of the place that was now her home. The house spoke of practicality, bare walls, sturdy furniture, little softness. Jacob cleared his throat. Ain't much, but it stood through more storms than I can count. Clara turned, offering a small smile. It looks like it's been cared for. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, but Jacob turned away quickly, pretending to fuss. With his hat, he wanted to say more, to bridge the silence, but the words tangled in his throat. He felt the weight of the town's whispers clinging to him like dust reminders of how everyone had stared when Clara walked down the aisle. That first supper together was quiet. Clara cooked, kneading dough with strong, practiced hands, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this work all her life. Jacob watched her from his chair, half grateful, half uneasy. He admired her capability, but part of him couldn't silence the voice whispering what others had said, that she was not the wife he had imagined. Clara, for her part, noticed the way his eyes slid away when she caught him watching. She felt the space between them like a canyon. He doesn't want me. Not truly, she thought, though she kept her face steady. She served him bread and stew, then sat opposite, eating quietly. The only sound was the clink of spoons and the creak of the old table. Finally, Jacob muttered, "This is good, best I've had in a while." Clara's heart lifted, just slightly. "Thank you." Nights were the hardest. Jacob set a quilt in the spare room, offering her the space without saying much. Clara understood. His hesitation, it wasn't rejection outright, but it was distance. As she lay alone, staring at the ceiling beams, doubt pressed down on her chest. Had she made a terrible mistake? Was she destined to be nothing more than a shadow in this man's life? Yet each morning, she rose early and set herself to work. She swept, scrubbed, and cooked with quiet diligence, determined to prove her worth in the only way she knew how. Jacob noticed the changes slowly, the floors shining, the shelves dusted, the smell of fresh bread filling the house. Still, the silence lingered between them. One evening, after a long day mending fences, Jacob came in to find Clara outside, chopping wood. Her sleeves were rolled up, her arms strong and sure with every swing of the axe. He paused, watching her. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, not delicate, not timid, but steady, capable, unflinching. When she noticed him, she straightened, wiping her brow. "I didn't mean to take over your chore," she said, almost apologetic. Jacob shook his head. "You don't have to do that." Her voice softened, though there was steel beneath it. "I want to pull my weight. I don't expect to sit idle." Something shifted in Jacob then. For the first time, he felt not embarrassment, but a flicker of admiration. She wasn't asking for, she was asking for partnership. Still, the awkwardness didn't vanish overnight. At church the next Sunday, the congregation's whispers followed them. Jacob held his head high. but he felt the sting of their judgment. Clara kept her chin up, though inside, the words cut deep. Back at the ranch, she asked quietly, "Are you ashamed of me?" Jacob froze. The question struck straight at the heart of what he'd been avoiding. His mouth opened, but no words came. Clara nodded once, tightly, and left the room before he could answer. That night, Jacob lay awake, staring at the ceiling, guilt gnawing at him. He realized he had let the town's gossip seep into his own thoughts. Yet when he remembered Clara's eyes at the altar steady searching, Bravey knew the truth. She deserved better than his silence. Their beginning was uneasy, tangled with doubt and distance. But beneath the awkward quiet, something was stirring respect, slowly breaking through the soil of uncertainty. Jacob didn't know how to speak it yet, and Clara didn't dare hope for it too soon. But as they moved through those first days, together working, eating, facing the whispers, they were planting the fragile seeds of something neither had expected, something that, with time, might grow. The uneasy silence between Jacob and Clara lingered into the following weeks, a quiet truce where neither dared to say what weighed on their hearts. But the land has its way of testing a person, and it didn't wait long to challenge them both. It began with the sky. A line of dark clouds gathered on the horizon one late afternoon, rolling in heavy and fast, the air growing thick with tension. Jacob stood on the porch, his jaw tightening. He knew the signs of a prairie storm: violent winds, sheets of rain, sometimes hail that could flatten crops and scatter cattle. "Clara," he called, already striding toward the barn. "We've got to get the herd in." Without hesitation, Clara dropped the laundry she'd been hanging and followed. Her skirts caught in the wind, but she kept pace with him. Together, they saddled 2 horses and rode hard toward the grazing field. The storm broke quickly. Rain lashed their faces, the wind howled, and thunder cracked overhead like cannon fire. The cattle were already restless, hooves churning the wet earth as lightning streaked across the sky. Jacob shouted over the storm, "Drive them toward the creek bed, it'll shield them some." Clara nodded, gripping the reins with steady hands. She had grown up doing hard farm work, and the storm did not rattle her as easily as it might another woman. She whistled sharply, urging the cattle, her strong voice carrying even through the gale. Jacob glanced her way and felt a surprising surge of pride. She rode with confidence, her determination unshaken by the chaos around them. They spent hours in the downpour, soaked to the bone, muscles burning as they fought to keep the herd together. Jacob's arm ached from swinging his lasso, his throat raw from shouting commands. Clara matched him, pushing her horse hard, her face set with fierce resolve. By the time they guided the last of the cattle into the sheltered creek bed, both were trembling with exhaustion, but the herd was safe. Back at the ranch house, they peeled off wet clothes and hung them by the fire. Jacob's hands shook from cold as he poured water from the kettle, but his eyes kept drifting to Clara. Her hair clung to her face, her dress plastered to her skin, but she looked radiant, alive, unbroken, and stronger than any woman he'd ever known. "You saved half the herd out there," he said hoarsely, his voice rough but genuine. Clara met his gaze, uncertain. "I only did what needed doing." Jacob shook his head. "No, I couldn't have managed it alone. You stood your ground. You," his words faltered, surprising even himself with their weight. "You're more of a partner than I ever deserved." For the first time since her arrival, Clara's guarded expression softened. A flicker of warmth passed between them, brief but real. But the storm's trial was not over. 2 calves had gone missing, swept downstream. Jacob discovered it the next morning, and without a second thought, Clara saddled up beside him to search. The creek was swollen, mud sucking at their boots as they trudged through waterlogged banks. Finally, they found 1 calf tangled in brush. Jacob waded in, but the current nearly dragged him under. Before he could protest, Clara grabbed hold of his arm and hauled him back, her strength shocking him. Together, they freed the calf and guided it to safety. By the time they returned home, Jacob was humbled. He realized he had underestimated her, not just her ability, but her will, her sheer grit. This was no fragile bride forced into his life. This was a woman who would fight storms, floods, and doubt itself if it meant protecting what mattered. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jacob broke the silence that had weighed on them for so long. "I've been a fool," he admitted quietly, "listening to whispers, letting pride blind me. But after today, after seeing what you've done for this ranch, I can't deny it anymore. You're stronger than any woman I've known, and I'm grateful." Clara's eyes glistened. In the firelight, she didn't speak at first, afraid hope might betray her. But then she said softly, "All I ever wanted was a chance, Jacob, not to be admired for how I look but for who I am and what I can give." His heart clenched at her words, the truth of them sinking deep. For the first time, Jacob reached across the table and took her hand, their fingers interlaced, rough with work, warm with something unspoken. And in that simple touch, Jacob knew the storm had not only tested their ranch, it had tested their bond. And against all odds, they had begun to endure. The storm had passed, leaving the prairie washed clean and the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. The cattle grazed quietly along the creek, their restlessness eased, while the ranch house stood sturdy against the horizon, a silent witness to the changes stirring inside it. Jacob sat on the porch that evening, the wooden boards creaking beneath his boots. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and violet as the sun sank low. For weeks, his heart had been in turmoil, caught between the image he once thought he wanted and the truth standing before him. He heard the sound of Clara moving inside, her steps steady, purposeful, each one reminding him that she had carried just as much weight, if not more, in this new marriage as he had. When she appeared in the doorway, her hair braided loosely over one shoulder and her apron dusted with flour from baking, Jacob found himself looking at her differently, not with surprise or hesitation, but with something warmer, deeper, an ache of gratitude he could no longer ignore. "Clara," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Come, sit a while." She hesitated, searching his face for clues. For so long she had braced herself against disappointment, against the fear of being a burden or a mistake he regretted. But something in his tone made her step out and settle beside him, her broad shoulders outlined in the glow of the sunset. For a moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the soft hum of crickets rising from the grass. Finally, Jacob turned to her. "I owe you the truth," he began. "When you first stepped off that train, I was stunned. Not because of who you are, but because of how blind I'd been. I let the picture in my head, the whispers in town, and my own foolish pride get in the way of seeing the woman right in front of me." Clara's breath caught. She lowered her gaze, her hands twisting in her lap. "I knew I wasn't what you expected," she whispered. "Every look, every silence told me so. I thought, perhaps, I'd made a mistake. Coming here." Jacob reached out, gently taking her hand in his. The gesture startled her. He had rarely offered touch since their wedding. His fingers, rough from years of ranch work, closed around hers with surprising tenderness. "You didn't make a mistake," he said firmly. "If anyone was mistaken, it was me. Clara, you've proven yourself in ways I never imagined. When the storm came, when the herd scattered, you didn't flinch. You fought harder than I did. You've held this home together when I couldn't find the courage to, because you've been my partner, even when I wasn't acting like one." Her eyes filled, though she blinked quickly to keep the tears at bay. "All I ever wanted was to be more than just accepted. I wanted to be loved for who I am." Jacob's chest tightened at her words. Slowly, as if testing the moment, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her calloused knuckles. "I do love you, Clara," he said, his voice low, but steady as a vow. "Not for what anyone else thinks, not for how you look, or don't look, but for the woman you are. Strong, honest, braver than I'll ever be. I was blind at the altar, but I see you now, and I don't want a day to pass without you by my side." The tears finally slipped down her cheeks, though a smile curved her lips through them. She turned toward him, searching his face, and found no hesitation, no shame, only truth. With a trembling laugh, she said, "I think you've just stunned me, Jacob." He chuckled softly, the tension that had shadowed their marriage breaking at last. He slid an arm around her shoulders, drawing her against him. She fit there, as though she'd always belonged, her presence steady, grounding. The prairie stretched before them, endless and untamed, but for the first time, Jacob didn't feel alone facing it. He had a wife now, a partner who had chosen him, and whom he had finally chosen in return. That as the last light faded from the sky, he whispered into her hair, "We'll face it all together, Clara. Storms, trials, whatever comes, as long as you'll let me love you." And in that moment, beneath the vast heavens and the promise of a new dawn, Clara's heart found what it had longed for all her life, not just a husband, but a man who saw her, truly and deeply. A love beyond appearances.